The stone gave way without warning. Marshall Whitaker had one heartbeat to understand what was happening, the groan of ancient mortar, the crack racing up the wall like a serpent. And then the ceiling of the Aldrath ruin came down on his skull, and the world went dark and quiet as a sealed tomb. He did not feel Kasha Doomhammer's hands on him. He did not feel her drag him by his collar across 20 feet of rubble-strewn floor, while the rest of the vault continued to collapse behind her, great slabs of sea-eaten limestone, crashing into the place where he had been standing a moment before. He did not feel her haul him up into her arms the way a person carries a child, not caring that he was a grown man, not caring that the dust was so thick she could barely see, not caring about anything except getting him out of that ruin and into the salt air of the cove before the whole rotten structure finished swallowing itself. He did not feel any of that. What he felt, eventually, was the sound of waves, not heard, felt. A low, rhythmic percussion working its way up through the rock beneath his back, through his bones, patient and enormous. Then the smell hit him, salt, kelp, something faintly smoky. And under all of it, something warm and leather-andiron that did not belong to the sea at all. Marshall opened his eyes. The sky above was deepening into indigo, the first stars pricking through in the east over the water. He was lying on flat rock at the mouth of a sea cave, the kind of rock that had been polished smooth by 1,000 years of tide. His head was resting on something folded, a cloak, he realized, not his own. He turned his head slowly, because his skull felt like it had been used as a hammer on an anvil, and found Kasha Doomhammer sitting 3 feet away from him with her knees drawn up and her forearms resting across them, watching the sea. He watched her for a long moment before she knew he was awake. She was not what most men pictured when they heard the word orc. She was not a hunched, tusked brute. She was taller than him by half a head when she stood, and built with the particular power of someone who had been fighting and working her body since childhood, all dense muscle and long lines, but curved, genuinely and strikingly curved in a way that her fitted warrior's leathers made no attempt to hide. The leathers were dark brown, worn to a shine at the elbows and knees, laced tight from her sternum to her waist in a way that showed exactly how broad her shoulders were and exactly how they tapered. Her legs were wrapped in close-cut riding breeches tucked into knee-high boots. She had bracers on her forearms, dark iron with a hammered geometric pattern, the mark of her Forge clan, he had learned. Her skin was the gray-green of deep water in winter, smooth and striking, and her hair was black and thick, pulled back from her face in a braid she had clearly done herself and in a hurry, because strands of it had come loose and were moving in the sea wind. Her tusks were modest, the lower pair barely longer than a man's eyeteeth, the upper ones absent, a trait that ran in some orc bloodlines and which made humans, he had noticed, absurdly more comfortable around her, as if a few inches of ivory were the whole barrier between civilization and savagery. Her eyes, when she finally sensed him watching and turned to look at him, were a dark amber that caught the last of the evening light like 2 coins in a fire. "You are awake," she said, not a question. Not relief outwardly, just a fact established. "Apparently," Marshall said, and his voice came out rough and scraped. "The ceiling fell." "The ceiling fell," she agreed. "And you carried me out. You were not walking anywhere on your own." He was quiet for a moment, processing that, processing the cloak under his head, processing the fact that she had stayed. "How long have I been out?" he asked. "Long enough for the tide to turn. 2 hours, perhaps a little more." He sat up slowly, pressing his palm to the back of his skull. There was a lump there the size of a large walnut, and when he pulled his hand away there was dried blood on his fingers, dark and rust brown. "Not fresh." Kasha's gaze tracked the movement, and something in her expression tightened, very briefly, before she controlled it. "You cleaned it," he said, feeling the absence of fresh blood. "It stopped on its own. I kept you on your side." Marshall Whitaker had spent 4 years as a lay brother in the cloister at Morn's Peak, long enough to learn basic medicine, long enough to understand what it meant that she had positioned him correctly, that she had stayed beside an unconscious man for 2 hours in a place where both of them had excellent reasons not to be seen. He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it with the full and quiet weight of someone who did not use words loosely. Kasha turned back to the sea. "Do not make it more than it is." But it already was more than it was, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. The cove was called Slant-Tooth by the smugglers who used it, named for the angled rock formation at its mouth that made it invisible from any passing ship, unless you knew exactly where to look and exactly what angle to approach from. The cliff face above it was riddled with cave passages, some natural, some cut by human hands 3 generations back, that connected to the old ruins of a watchtower the locals called Aldrath. The tower itself had been abandoned after a sea storm partially collapsed it, but the caves and coves beneath it were another matter. They were busy places, if you knew the right people. And Marshall, in the 6 months since he had left the cloister with nothing but his brown wool travel coat and a satchel of dried herbs, had made it his business to know the right people. He had not planned to become a smuggler's contact. He had not planned most of what had happened since he left Morn's Peak. He had simply needed to eat, and eating required coin, and coin required work, and the work that found him carrying sealed crates up from the water at night, keeping a rough accounting ledger for a man named Sallow, who ran the cove's operations, paid better than anything else available to a man with no trade, no family name, and no particular skills except reading, herb lore, and the capacity to carry quite a lot of weight without complaining. Kasha had appeared in the cove 7 weeks ago. She had arrived in a fishing boat with 2 orc men who worked as heavy labor for the Sallow network, and she had stepped onto the dock in the gray pre-dawn with the absolute assurance of someone who had arrived exactly where she meant to arrive. She had spoken to Sallow in a level, unhurried voice about a matter of business, a shipment of smelted iron coming up the coast that needed to bypass the dockmaster's tariff at Cravenmouth, and Peric, who was not a timid man, had been noticeably careful with his words. Marshall had been at the edge of the dock making himself inconspicuous, which was a skill he had developed thoroughly. He had watched her. He had noticed everything about her, with the careful observational habit of someone who had spent 4 years in silence with nothing to do but pay attention to the world around him. And what he noticed, beyond the obvious physical fact of her, was the way her eyes moved constantly, precisely, logging everything and finding most of it beneath real concern, until those amber eyes landed on him, and stayed there for just a half-second longer than everything else. Then she had looked away and continued her negotiation with Peric, and Marshall had gone back to his ledger and pretended he had not felt that half-second like a coal pressed against his sternum. She was in Slant-Tooth because of a clan matter that she had explained to no one completely, and to Marshall partially over the weeks that followed. Her name, Doomhammer, was a Forge clan name, and the Forge clans had interests in the iron trade that were entangled with the coastal smuggling routes, in ways that a full accounting would have filled 10 of Marshall's ledgers. The short version was that she was watching over a shipment and watching over Sallow's reliability, and the watching required her to be present in the cove on and off for the weeks until the shipment cleared. What this meant in practice was that Marshall Whitaker and Kasha Doomhammer ended up in the same cramped underground spaces quite a lot. The first time she had borrowed his lantern, she had returned it without comment. The second time, she had returned it with a brief, "Your wick needs trimming." The third time she had trimmed it herself before returning it, which he found, for reasons he could not entirely articulate, strangely intimate. By the 4th week, he was holding the lantern for her without being asked, and she was showing him which passages in the cave network were structurally sound, and which ones she had tested with the careful eye of someone who understood stone. And by the 5th week, they were working alongside each other with the easy, wordless rhythm of people who have learned each other's habits. He had not kissed her. He had not touched her beyond what was practical, a hand on her elbow in a dark passage, 2 fingers on her wrist when he needed her attention. He had wanted to do more than that since approximately the 2nd week, and he had done nothing about it. And he was fairly sure she knew this, and he was completely sure that she had chosen to leave it alone too, and he did not know whether that was because she did not want it or because she was waiting for something. He was not, by nature, a man who pushed. That restraint was about to become a problem, because tomorrow, before his skull had nearly been caved in by a ceiling, before the entire evening had shifted into something rower and more honest, Sallow had informed him that a man named Goreth Blacktide was coming to the cove. Goreth Blacktide was an Orc clan champion. He was also, according to Peric's delicately phrased account, a man with a long-standing interest in the Doomhammer woman. Marshall had asked what that meant, and Peric had given him a look that said quite plainly, "It means exactly what you think it means, and it means trouble, and it is not your concern." But sitting on the rock in the salt evening with the back of his head aching and Kasha 2 feet away from him and her cloak under his skull, it felt very much like his concern. "Kasha," he said. She looked at him. "Peric told me about Goreth Blacktide." The change in her face was small and controlled, but he was very good at reading small and controlled. Her jaw set. Her eyes went flat. Not afraid she was not, he had established firmly, capable of fear in the ordinary sense, but something cold and predetermined moved through her expression and settled. "Peric talks more than he should," she said. "He does," Marshall agreed. "Is it true?" "Which part?" "The part where Blacktide has claimed interest in a formal courtship that you have not accepted." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the amber eyes that always seemed to be measuring something. "Among my people, formal interest from a champion carries weight," she said carefully. "To refuse it cleanly without insult requires either a demonstrated prior claim from another or a willingness to face a challenge from the champion's supporters. And you have neither." "I have the second," she said, with a tone that made clear she would not lose that challenge but that it would not be clean. "The first requires," she stopped. "A prior claim," Marshall said, "from someone else." "Yes." The sea moved below them in the dark. A torch was lit somewhere deeper in the cave system, throwing a faint orange glow from one of the tunnel mouths. "And Blacktide arrives tomorrow," Marshall said. "Tomorrow evening by Peric's count." Marshall was quiet for a moment, pressing the blood-stiff hair at the back of his head, thinking about the cloister and the 4 years of lessons on patience and discernment and how to know the difference between a feeling and a fact. He looked at Kasha Doomhammer, who was watching the sea with the face of someone who had already decided to face the second option because she would not ask for the first. "Suppose," he said, "that you had the first option." She turned to look at him, very slowly. "Suppose there was a prior claim," he continued. "Someone who could stand beside you when Blacktide arrives and make it credible enough that there is no reason for a challenge." "Who would do that?" she said, in a tone that was not quite a question. "I would," Marshall said. The silence stretched. The torch in the tunnel mouth guttered in the cave breath. "You understand what that means among my people," she said. "It is not simply standing nearby and looking companionable. A claim is a claim. Blacktide will test it. He will want evidence of intent." "I understand," Marshall said. "And you are a human man who keeps ledgers for a dockside smuggler and has no clan and no standing." "Also true. Why would you do this?" she asked, and for the first time he heard something beneath the controlled surface of her voice, something that was not coldness and not calculation. Something that was quietly and genuinely asking. "Because you carried me out of that ruin," he said, and then more honestly, "and because I have been wanting a reason for 5 weeks. Kasha looked at him for a long time. Then she looked back at the sea and he watched her jaw work, watched some internal argument play out behind those amber eyes. "It would need to look real," she said. "It would need to be real," he corrected gently. "I do not do things by halves." Another silence. Then, almost inaudibly, "Neither do I." "Then we understand each other." She reached over without looking at him and picked up the hem of his sleeve, checking it, turning his wrist in her hand. He held very still. Her thumb pressed briefly against the inside of his wrist where his pulse ran close to the surface, and he felt that touch in his back teeth. "Your color is good," she said, releasing him. "You will not have a concussion." "Good," he managed. "Sleep tonight. I need you conscious when Blacklight arrives." "You also needed me conscious tonight, and that went somewhat poorly." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was the architecture of one, low in her throat. "I carried you out once. I can do it again." "I do not doubt it," Marshall said sincerely. "I just prefer to walk." This time she did laugh, very briefly and very quietly, and Marshall Whitaker filed that sound away in the most careful part of his memory. Gorath Blacktide arrived the following evening with 2 of his men, and a bearing that announced, without words, that he considered the cove to belong to him by right of arrival. He was broad-shouldered and impressive in the way of a man accustomed to being the most physically significant person in any room. His tusks were prominent, his scale-worked armor well-maintained, his gray-green skin carrying the ritual scarring of a clan champion along his jaw and the ridge of one cheekbone. He was not without reason to be confident. He was, Marshall observed from across the dock while pretending to work on a rope splice, also looking for Kasha with the particular scanning alertness of a man who had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided to act on it. Kasha was standing at the far end of the dock. She was standing there because Marshall was standing beside her, close, with one hand resting at the small of her back, her actual back, warm leather and the solid reality of her beneath it. And when Gorath Blacktide found her across the dock and began walking, she turned slightly into Marshall's shoulder and said, low and even, "Steady." "I am steady," Marshall said quietly. "He is going to try to make you feel small. Men have been trying that since I was 12. I'm not easy to reduce." She tilted her head and looked at him just slightly, and there was something in her face at that moment, a quick, startled reassessment, that he felt was more valuable than almost anything he had been given in his life. Gorath Blacktide stopped 6 feet away. His eyes went from Kasha to Marshall and back, taking a slow inventory. His expression did what expressions often did when men like him encountered Marshall Whitaker. It underestimated. "Doomhammer," Gorath said, in Orcish-accented common. "I was told I would find you here." "You were told correctly," Kasha said. Her voice was perfectly level. Gorath's gaze moved to Marshall again, longer this time, pointed. "Who is this?" "Marshall Whitaker," Kasha said, and she said it as one says a name that belongs to something important. She paused 1/2 beat, and Marshall felt that pause like the edge of a knife. "My man," the word landed. Gorath's eyes went flat. "Your man," he repeated. "That is what I said." "A human ledger keeper," Gorath said, with a contempt he did not bother to hide. He spoke the word human the way a man spits a cherry pit. "A man who is with me," Kasha said. The temperature in her voice dropped 3 degrees. Gorath looked at Marshall directly now, and Marshall met his eyes without flinching, without aggression, with the particular calm of someone who has spent 4 years in a cloister learning that stillness is not weakness. He did not fold his arms or reach for the knife at his belt. He just looked back at Gorath Blacktide and waited. "You," Gorath said to Marshall. "You understand what you are claiming. You understand who you are standing beside." "I do," Marshall said. "Do you?" The silence on the dock had gone sharp. Sallow had found somewhere urgent to be. 2 of the dock workers had gone still in the way of people who do not want to be noticed. "Doomhammer," Gorath said, turning back to Kasha with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided to treat the obstacle as irrelevant. "I came here to make formal my interest. We have spoken of this before. I'm a champion of the Blacktide clan. My family has standing. An alliance between us would—" "I have heard this," Kasha said. "I have heard it more than once. My answer has not changed." "Your answer was incomplete. It did not cite a prior claim." He said it like a point of law, which in Orc custom it essentially was. "I was not informed of a prior claim." "You are informed now." Gorath's jaw worked. He looked at Marshall again, and this time there was something genuinely calculating in his eyes, something that was colder than contempt. "A claim can be contested," he said, "if it is not demonstrably established." Marshall had been warned about this. Kasha had told him the night before, sitting on the cliff ledge with the sea below them, he will want proof that is visible. Among orc custom, a claimed partnership carried marks. Not always permanent, not always formal, but something that was more than words. An oath binding, a gift exchange, a mark. Then consider it demonstrated, Marshall said. He turned to Kasha fully and without asking her permission, because they had talked about this last night and she had looked him in the eye and nodded once, and that was more than enough. He reached up and put his hand along the side of her face, his thumb below her cheekbone, and he kissed her. Not briefly, not performatively. He kissed her the way a man kisses a woman he has been wanting for 5 weeks, and is not pretending about anything, slow and certain. And after one startled heartbeat in which Kasha went absolutely still, she kissed him back with a force that rearranged every assumption he had made about how much of this was pretend. He pulled back before it became something that should not be witnessed on a dock. His hand stayed at her face for a moment more. Her hand had come up to his forearm without him noticing, her fingers wrapped around it, and neither of them let go immediately. Goreth Blacktide said nothing for a long moment. There was a kind of furious recalibration happening behind his eyes. "This is not over," he said quietly. "It was never started," Kasha said. Her voice was calm. Her fingers were still on Marshall's arm. Goreth looked at Marshall with a cold specificity that was unmistakably a promise of trouble, and then he walked back the way he had come. His 2 men followed. The dock breathed again. Peric Sallow reappeared from wherever he had been, dusting off his coat. "Well," he said, "that could have been worse." Marshall became aware that his heart was moving considerably faster than it should be, and that Kasha's hand was still on his arm and that she had not let go. He did not either. The days that followed had the quality of a slow fuse. Goreth did not leave the cove. He set himself up in one of the upper cave chambers with his 2 men and established a watchful, deliberate presence. He was too canny to challenge outright. Kasha's reputation with a blade was not secret, and Marshall's status as Peric Sallow's bookkeeper gave him a degree of practical protection in the cove's social ecosystem. But he created friction everywhere he could. Small things. Tools moved. A supply of fresh water accidentally redirected. A conversation with Peric that Marshall did not get to hear, but that left Peric looking troubled the rest of the afternoon. Marshall and Kasha, meanwhile, were living an extremely close approximation of the thing they had announced on the dock, and neither of them had yet addressed what that meant. They shared a fire in the evenings, down in the largest cave where the others gathered too. They sat together. She tended the lump on the back of his head with a matter-of-fact practicality that involved her hands in his hair more than was strictly medically necessary, and that he was absolutely not going to point out. When he worked on his ledgers, she sometimes sat near him and sharpened her blades. There was something deeply companionable about the sound of a whetstone on iron, and he found he produced better work in that quiet than he ever had alone. But they had not talked about the kiss. Not directly. On the 3rd night after Goreth's arrival, they were the last 2 at the fire. The others had gone to their sleeping spots. The cave was quiet except for the distant, constant voice of the sea and the pop of the coals. Kasha said without looking at him, "You are doing something." "I am sitting by a fire," Marshall said. "You are being patient at me," she said, deliberately. "I can tell the difference between a patient man and a man who has decided that patience is a strategy." "Can you?" he said. He was surprised and a little amused. "It is a particular kind of stillness," she said. "The cloister trained you to it, but it is not the same as not wanting." The fire crackled. He was quiet for a moment, considering. "No," he said finally. "It is not the same as not wanting." She looked at him. In the firelight her skin had a warmth that the daylight did not quite give it, bronze and deep green, and her amber eyes were fully gold now with the flames reflected. She was sitting cross-legged with her elbows on her knees, close enough that he could have reached her without moving. "What did the cloister teach you about wanting things?" she asked, not mockingly, genuinely. "To examine whether the want was real before acting on it," he said. "To be honest about the source of it. And is this one real? Yes, he said, no performance in it, no hesitation. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with those measuring eyes that never quite resolved into anything predictable. I do not do half arrangements, she said. The kiss on the dock was a necessity. I understand that, but if it becomes more than that, it is not a performance anymore, and I do not— She stopped, worked something over in her jaw. I do not take those things lightly. I know, he said. Neither do I. That is why I have been patient. You have been patient for 5 weeks before that. Yes, she looked at him. Why? Because you are not someone to rush at, he said simply. You are someone to be honest with, and I was not entirely sure yet what the honest thing was. And now I am sure, he said, but it is your decision to make, not mine. Kasha was quiet for a long time. The coals shifted, throwing brief sparks up into the dark of the cave. She reached across the space between them, not to his face or his hands, but to the front of his coat, and she took hold of the lapel, just held it, like she was testing the weight of something. The pretend courtship, she said carefully. I do not want it to be pretend. Marshall covered her hand with his. The iron and leather smell of her was very close now. It was not pretend from my side, he said. It never was. She looked at him for another long moment, then closed the remaining distance herself, slowly and deliberately, and kissed him the way she had kissed him back on the dock, not gently, not cautiously, but with a fullness and certainty that made it abundantly clear she had been thinking about this just as long as he had. He brought both hands up to her face, careful of her, and she made a low sound against his mouth that was more eloquent than any sentence. When they pulled apart, she was still holding his lapel, and he was still holding her face, and neither of them tried to compose themselves into anything calmer. This is going to complicate things, she said. Things were already complicated, he said. His voice was rough. Gorath will push harder. Then we will deal with Gorath, he said, together. She looked at him, and the thing that moved through her eyes was not the cold measurement he had seen before. It was something warmer and more vulnerable and more fierce all at once, and he thought, there it is. That is the real thing under all the armor. Together, she said, as if testing the shape of the word. Together, he confirmed. She released his lapel. He released her face. They sat by the fire for another hour, close enough that their shoulders touched, not talking, and it was the most companionable silence Marshall Whitaker had known since he could remember. The iron shipment arrived 2 weeks after Gorath Blacktide, coming in on a fat-bellied coastal barge that anchored outside the cove's blind spot and transferred its cargo in flat-bottomed boats at 3 in the morning. Marshall was on the dock with a lantern and his ledger, recording quantities, while the orc laborers carried crates, and Perrick watched the operation from the cliff path with the nervous energy of a man who knew exactly how many things could go wrong. Kasha was managing the transfer from the water's edge, directing the boats with quiet authority, and she was extraordinary at it, calm, precise, accounting for every variable. Marshall watched her work when he could afford to take his eyes off his ledger, and he felt the particular satisfaction of watching someone be completely and brilliantly themselves. Gorath Blacktide was also watching the transfer. He was standing at the upper dock with his arms folded, and Marshall caught him looking not at the cargo but at Kasha, with an expression that had moved past courtship calculation into something harder. After the transfer was logged and the boats had pushed back out and the dock was clearing, Gorath came down to the lower dock. He waited for Kasha to finish a final count of the crates, and when she straightened and turned and found him in front of her, he said, "We should talk, privately." "Whatever you want to say can be said here," Kasha said. Gorath's eyes moved to Marshall, who was 6 feet away with his ledger. "Your human does not need to hear clan business." "My man," Kasha said, the word carrying a weight and specificity that was not quite the easy performance it had been on the first day, "is not a condition I manage around other people's preferences." Gorath's composure cracked just slightly. "Kasha, think about what you are doing. The Doomhammer clan has alliances to consider. The Blacktide champion interest is a genuine— I understand what it is," she said. "I have always understood what it is. It has never been unclear to me, and my answer has never been unclear either, and I need you to hear me now, Gorath, clearly and finally. No, not as a matter of incomplete information, not as a matter of prior claim requiring contest. As a matter of my own will, which is the only matter that has ever governed this question. No. Goreth looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Marshall, and the look was not contempt this time, but something more careful and more genuine and somehow more dangerous for it. You would choose a human man, he said, not a challenge now, something almost disbelieving. I would choose this man, Kasha said. Yes. Marshall met Goreth's eyes across the dock. He did not flinch. He did not smile. He just held the look steadily, the same way he had the first day, and after a moment Goreth black-eyed looked away. This is not finished, Goreth said. The clan will have my decision when I bring it to them, Kasha said. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked. You do not carry my decisions to the clan before I make them. He left without another word. Perik Sallow appeared from the shadows of the cliff path looking visibly relieved. Smooth as a fresh-filed blade, he muttered at Marshall as he passed. Marshall finished his ledger entry and looked up at Kasha, who was watching the cave mouth where Goreth had disappeared. There was something complicated on her face that he had not seen before. You said you would choose this man, he said quietly. She turned to look at him. I did. That was not performance. No, she said, it was not. He walked the few steps between them and stopped in front of her. The dock was mostly empty now, the night workers drifting toward the cave passages and sleep. The sea was calm and black and immense beyond the rock mouth of the cove. I am choosing you too, he said, in case that was not already obvious. The look she gave him, direct and warm and startled all at once, as if she had been waiting for it and still not fully expected it, was one he would keep for the rest of his life. The trouble came 3 days later, as trouble generally does, at an inconvenient moment and from an unexpected direction. Marshall was deep in the cave system, in one of the mid-level passages that connected the dock caves to the old Aldrath ruin above. He was there because Perik had asked him to check a cache of documents, trade papers, primarily, the kind that needed to be kept dry and datable, that were stored in a waterproof chest in one of the side chambers. It was routine. He had done it twice before. He did not know that Goreth Blacktide's man had followed him. The passage was narrow at this point, barely shoulder-wide, cut into the cliff stone with old iron tools and lit by a single oil lamp at intervals. Marshall was crouching at the chest, hands on the oilcloth wrapping, when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. One of Goreth's men, the taller one, built like a cartload of river stone, was standing in the passage with his arms folded and the expression of someone who has been asked to deliver a message that is not actually a message. Blackdyde wants to speak with you, the man said. Blackdyde can find me at the dock in the morning, Marshall said, turning back to the chest. He wants to speak with you now. A pause. Alone. Marshall closed the chest lid and stood, turning to face the man fully. He was calm. He had learned in the cloister that calm was its own kind of armor, that a man who could not be rattled was harder to deal with than a man who was afraid. If Goreth Blackdyde wants a conversation with me, he said, he can have it in a place where people can see us, like a man of standing conducts his business, not in a cave at night with you in the only exit. The silence that followed confirmed that yes, this was exactly what Goreth had intended. The man took a step forward. Marshall did not run. There was nowhere to run to. He picked up the nearest thing available to him, which was the oil lamp from the wall bracket, and held it between them in a way that was not a weapon but was a credible threat of one, considering they were both standing in an enclosed space full of oil-soaked timber bracings. Think carefully, Marshall said. Man stopped, looked at the lamp, looked at the bracings. Tell Goreth, Marshall said, that his best path through this problem is the one where he leaves the cove with his dignity and his safety and his clan relationships intact. Remind him that the Doomhammer Forge clan controls smelting access for 3 coastal routes. Remind him that Perik Sallow works with the Doomhammers because it is profitable. And remind him that threatening the man who keeps Perik's ledgers is the kind of thing Perik takes personally. He was making most of this up. He was very calm about making it up. The man held for a long moment, assessing. Then, with the deliberateness of someone who has been given enough to think about, he stepped back. He walked back down the passage the way he had come. Marshall stood very still for a moment, the lamp warm in his hand, listening to the footsteps recede. Then he put the lamp back on the bracket, picked up the oilcloth-wrapped documents, and walked back to the dock at a measured pace. He found Kasha at the mouth of the lower cave, sharpening her belt knife with a whetstone and a focused expression. She looked up when he came in. She looked at his face. "What happened?" she said immediately. "Aldrath sent a man to have a conversation with me in the document passage," he said. She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. "Are you hurt?" "No, I talked my way out of it." He sat on the nearest crate, feeling the adrenaline working its way out of his legs now that he was safe. "It was fine. I am fine." She stood in front of him, looking at him with those amber eyes that were doing a very fast and very complete damage assessment. Her jaw was set in the way it's set when she was working to control something significant. "He threatened you," she said. "He put me in a position where a threat was possible," Marshall said carefully. "I do not think he was specifically authorized to harm me, only to pressure. But I take your point. This is because of me," she said. Flat certain, not guilt, exactly, more like a tactical reality she was absorbing. "He is coming at you because you are beside me." "Yes," Marshall said, "that is also a position I chose." "I did not choose it for you to be at risk, Kasha." He said her name quietly and she stopped. He looked at her directly. "I left a cloister to come into the world. I made that choice because I wanted to live in the actual world, with its actual difficulties and actual risks, rather than behind walls where nothing would happen to me. The risk of being beside you is part of the actual world, and I want it." She looked at him for a long moment with something working behind her eyes. "You are not afraid," she said, as if she was still slightly surprised by this fact. "I am sometimes afraid," he corrected. "I am not ruled by it." She sat down on the crate beside him, close, her knee touching his. She reached over and put her hand over his, flat and deliberate. He turned his hand over and held hers. "Aldrath needs to understand that threatening you is a mistake he cannot take back," she said. "I need to deal with him directly." "How?" Marshall asked. "By making the situation clear in terms he respects." She paused. "In my culture there is a custom. When a clan member or a bonded partner carries a mark from the choosing person, a claiming bite placed at the shoulder, it means the bond has been formally sealed. It is public. It is permanent. It supersedes any outstanding courtship claim because it means the choosing has already happened and been accepted on both sides." She looked at him sideways. "It is not a small thing." "I understand," he said. "And among your people it has no formal standing. It is an orc custom. A human man wearing such a mark would be noticed by my people and by anyone who knows what it means." "And Aldrath would have no standing to contest it," Marshall said. "No, because a sealed bond is not a courtship. It is not a negotiation. There is nothing to challenge." She paused. "But I am not suggesting you accept this as a strategy. It is also what it is. It would mean something real." He was quiet. The sound of the sea filled the cave around them, steady and permanent. "Where would it be?" he asked. "Left shoulder," she said, "under the collar, where a blade cannot reach it." He reached up and pulled the collar of his coat away from his left shoulder, exposing the curve of it. He looked at her. "Then do it," he said. "Not for Aldrath, because I want it to mean what it means." Kasha was very still for a moment. Then she reached up with her free hand and touched the side of his neck lightly, finding the place. Her teeth were not the prominent tusks of a full clan warrior, but they were stronger than a human's, and the mark she placed at the juncture of his neck and shoulder was deliberate and slow and nothing like accidental, and he felt it not as pain but as a warmth that spread outward from the point of contact and settled somewhere deep and permanent in his chest. She pulled back. Her eyes met his. "It will mark," she said, "for a few weeks at least." "Good," he said. She looked at the mark for a moment with an expression he had never seen on her face before, fierce and tender in equal, unprecedented measure. Then she pulled his collar back up gently, and he caught her hand before she could withdraw it and held it at his jaw, and she let him. "Kasha," he said. "Do not make it sentimental," she said. Her voice was slightly unsteady. "I am going to anyway," he said. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever met, including everyone in the cloister, and one of the brothers there claimed to have seen an angel." She laughed fully and genuinely, and the sound of it bounced off the cave walls and filled the space, and Marshall felt it in his ribs like a bell being rung. He did not plan for the mark to be discovered. It happened the next morning in the most mundane possible way. He was washing his face and neck at the water barrel on the upper dock, and his collar fell open, and Peric Sallow, who was passing with a cup of tea, stopped walking. "Whitaker," Peric said, slowly. Marshall straightened and pulled his collar closed. "Peric." Was that a— Peric pointed vaguely at his own neck. "Because that looked like a— Yes," Marshall said. Peric stared at him for a long moment. "A claiming bite," he said, not a question. "Yes." "From Doomhammer." "Yes." Peric looked at the ceiling of the cave above them, which was solid rock and not a deity, but sometimes a man needed somewhere to direct his expressions. "Do you have any idea," he said, "what that means for my operation if the Blacktide clan decides this is an insult that requires— Goreth Blacktide's clan interest in Kasha has been extinguished," Marshall said. "A sealed bond supersedes courtship claim. There is nothing to contest. That is orc custom, Whitaker, not— Then it should satisfy Goreth, who is an orc," Marshall said. "And the Doomhammer Forge clan controls smelting access for 3 coastal routes, which makes their goodwill more valuable to you than Blacktide's." Peric stared at him. "You actually worked that out." "I keep your ledgers," Marshall said. "I know what the numbers say." Peric was quiet for a moment, tea steaming in his hand. "You are either very clever or very in love," he said. "Both, ideally," Marshall said. As it happened, the discovery did not stay with Peric alone. Goreth Blacktide's taller man had been on the upper dock when the collar fell open. Marshall did not know this until 2 hours later, when Kasha found him at the ledger table with a look on her face that said something had happened. "Goreth's man saw the mark," she said. Marshall sat back in his chair. "How is Goreth taking it?" "He is—" She stopped, controlled something. "He came to me just now, outside the sleeping cave." "What did he say?" Her jaw was set in the way it had been on the very first morning before he had known her well enough to read it. "He said that a human's claiming bite is not a sealed bond. He said that the mark means nothing because you cannot formally bond by orc custom, because you have no clan standing to make the exchange valid." "Is that true?" Marshall asked carefully. "Under your law, he is stretching what is true," she said. "The custom requires an exchange. A bite mark on one partner is half of a claiming. The claiming is complete when both partners carry the mark." She paused. He pointed this out to 3 other orc workers on the dock in front of them. Marshall understood. He stood up. "Where is Goreth now?" "Lower dock." "Marshall, you do not need to. I am going to go have a conversation with him," Marshall said. "I can handle Goreth." "I know you can," he said. "But this is also my matter. He is calling the bond incomplete because I only carry your mark and you do not carry mine." "I would like to address that." She looked at him. "You understand what addressing it means." "You place your mark on me," he said. "I place mine on you. That is the exchange." "Yes." The thing that moved through her face at that moment, a flash of something hot and unguarded and quickly controlled, told him everything about how much she had not asked for this and how much she wanted it. "You would carry a bite mark from an orc woman," she said. "In front of your own people, in front of anyone." "With considerable pride," Marshall said. She looked at him for a long moment in the quiet of the cave, with the sea running its permanent commentary in the background, and then she said, "Follow me." She led him back to the lower dock. Goreth was there with his man and 2 of the orc laborers, exactly as she had said, and he turned as they approached with the bearing of a man who expected another negotiation. Kasha said nothing. She walked past Goreth entirely, stopped in front of Marshall on the open dock, reached up and pulled his collar open at the left shoulder, and in full view of everyone present, Goreth, his man, the laborers, Peric, who had followed like a moth drawn to catastrophe, and 2 human dockworkers who did not quite know what they were watching. She put her own mark at the crook of his neck and shoulder, deliberate and warm and permanent. Then she stepped back and pulled his collar closed with a gentleness that was completely at odds with the warrior set of her shoulders, and she turned to Gorath and said, in the level final tone of someone stating a fact that is not open for commentary, "Exchange complete." Gorath looked at Marshall. Marshall looked at Gorath, his hand at his own collar, perfectly calm. The laborers exchanged glances. One of them said something in Orcish that Marshall did not catch, but that Kasha's brief ghost of a smile told him was favorable. Gorath held for a long moment, the last of his argument running out through the cracks in his composure. His man watched him. The doc watched him. "I will inform the Black-Dyed clan," Gorath said finally in the tone of a man performing a strategic withdrawal with his dignity mostly intact, "that the Doomhammer matter is settled." "It is," Kasha said. "He left the next morning. Both of his men with him." Paraxalo watched them go from the cliff path and then came down and refilled his tea and said, to no one in particular, "Good riddance to difficult commerce," and went back to his counting house. Marshall found Kasha on the outer rocks above the tide line, looking out at the water. He climbed up and sat beside her. "It is over," he said. "For now," she said. "The Black-Dyed clan will be informed. There may be formal objection through the Doomhammer Council. I will need to go before my clan at some point and account for the bond." "I know," he said. "I will come with you," she looked at him, "to an Orc clan council." "You sat beside me for 2 hours while I was unconscious in a ruin," he said. "I think I can manage a clan council." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she reached over and took his hand, turning it palm up, lacing her fingers through his with a care and deliberateness that was the opposite of casual. They sat there in the salt wind above the cove, with the sea enormous and indifferent below them, and Marshall felt the mark at his shoulder like a warm coal. He looked at her. "You were always going to choose someone who was worth choosing," he said. "Was I?" she said, dry and fond. "Yes, you are not a woman who settles. You are not a woman who makes decisions for convenience. Whatever you choose completely." She was quiet. "I just needed to show you I could hold steady," he said, "that I would not fold, that I meant what I said." "You showed me," she said, quietly, without deflection. "And you chose me," he said. "I chose you," she said. "I would do it again." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to the back of it briefly, and she let him. And above them the sky was wide and gray-blue and full of incoming weather, and neither of them moved. The iron shipment cleared Cravenmouth without incident 2 days later. The dockmaster's tariff was successfully avoided. Paraxalo paid out shares, Marshall's included, and there was a brief general satisfaction around the cave fires that was the closest thing to a celebration the cove usually produced. But the weather turned that evening. The coast brought its storms without much warning, just a deep bruising of the western horizon, and a shift in the wind that the seabirds knew before anyone else. Marshall was on the outer rocks checking the mooring lines on one of the flat-bottomed boats when the wind jumped from a steady push to something with real intent behind it. He got the line secured and was working his way back along the cliff path slick now, rain beginning. The path barely a foot wide above a 20-foot drop to dark water, when his boot found a loose stone and he went sideways. He caught the rock face. Caught it with both hands, scraped and bleeding, hanging half off the path with his feet scrabbling for purchase, heart going like a smith's hammer. He got one foot braced on a crevice and pulled himself up and back onto the path, and stood there for a moment just breathing. Then Kasha's hand closed around his collar from behind, hauling him fully upright and back against the cliff face, and her body was a solid wall behind him, blocking the wind and the drop both. "I have you," she said into his ear, loud over the wind. "I have myself mostly," he said, breathless, "but thank you." Her arm was across his chest, pinning him to the rock. "Do not move until the gust passes." I was not planning to. The gust passed. The rain was proper now, cold and determined. She moved her arm and he turned around on the narrow path to face her, and they were very close, the cliff at his back, the wind driving spray against them both. She was looking at him with an expression that had abandoned all pretense of control, Just open concern, direct and fierce and not hidden. "That was close," she said. "I know," he said. "You could have gone over." "I know." He reached up and pushed a wet strand of her hair back from her face, and she stood very still at that touch in the rain. "I did not. Marshall." His name in her mouth had a quality at that moment that made him feel like the only real thing in the world. "I need you to be more careful." "I will be more careful," he said. "I am serious." "I know you are serious." He kept his hand at her face, the rain running over both of them. "I take it entirely seriously. I have every intention of being alive for a considerable time to come." She looked at him for a long moment, rain and wind and the enormous dark sea below, and then she put both hands on his face and kissed him with a ferocity that was not performance or strategy or anything other than pure unfiltered what she felt. And he kissed her back with everything he had, the cliff solid at his back, her warmth against the cold rain, the world reduced to the exact dimensions of this. Eventually she pulled back, both of them breathing. "Come inside," she said. "Yes," he said. They went inside. The storm kept the cove sealed for 2 days, no boats in or out. The cave system became its own small world, condensed and warm and lamplit, smelling of salt and wood smoke, and the particular lived-in closeness of people who were not going anywhere. Marshall and Kasha spent most of those 2 days in the comfortable inevitability of two people who have passed some invisible threshold and are simply, finally, themselves together. They talked more in those 2 days than in all the preceding weeks combined. He told her about the cloister, the austerity of it, the genuine peace he had found there and then genuinely outgrown. The mornings of silent prayer that had taught him stillness, and the evening when he had understood that stillness without the world pressing against it was not peace but avoidance. He had left on a Tuesday, in the early spring rain, with his brown coat and his herb satchel, and no plan at all. She told him about the Forge clan, and the particular weight of being a warrior woman in a culture that valued warrior women in theory and found them complicated in practice. She had been running her own affairs since her 17th year, after her father's death in a border skirmish. She had built her standing through work and through the specific reputation of someone who kept her word completely and could not be pressured or purchased. The black-dyed champion's interest had been following her for 2 years, and it had always made her tired in the way that determined, entitled attention makes a person tired, and she had never found the clean exit from it until now. "Until me," Marshall said. "You were not my clean exit," she said, with her customary dry precision. "You were my clean choice. The exit was a consequence." "I am glad to be both," he said. On the second evening of the storm, with the wind dropped to a low moan and the rain tapping steadily at the rock above them, they were side by side on a bedroll near the cave's far wall, well apart from where Peric and the dock workers slept, and Kasha was leaning against his shoulder, and he had his arm around her, and there was a lamp burning low on a ledge nearby. She said quietly, "I would like to go before the Doomhammer Council with you, not because I am required to, or because of the formal bond process, but because I want my clan to know who you are." "I would be honored," he said. "They will be opinionated," she said. "Clans tend to be. Some of them will not accept it easily." "Some of my old brothers at the cloister would not accept it easily either," he said. "People who love you tend to have opinions about who else loves you. We will handle it." She tilted her head back to look up at him. "You say, we very naturally." "I have been thinking in terms of we for a while now," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those amber eyes that he had learned like a language, what each shade of gold meant, what the slight differences in their set communicated. This shade, right now, was something he had only seen a few times, warm and open and without any reserve at all. She reached up and touched the mark at his shoulder through his coat. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. "No," he said. "It feels like exactly what it is." She was quiet for a moment. "I have not. This is the first time I have given this mark," she said. "I want you to know that it was not strategy when I placed it, not even in the beginning. I told myself it was both things, but it was not." He brought her hand down from his shoulder to his chest, flat over his heart. "I know," he said. She could feel his heartbeat under her palm. She knew this because her expression shifted very slightly, as if something had just been confirmed. "Marshall," she said. "Yes." "I love you," she said, in the same tone she used for facts, for things that were simply, irreducibly true. He looked at her for a moment, and the stillness the cloister had given him held for exactly 2 seconds and then came entirely apart, and what replaced it was something much more alive and much warmer and infinitely more real. "I love you," he said. "Completely." She kissed him then, not with the urgency of the cliff path or the dock, but with a slow and certain thoroughness, and the lamp burned lower on the ledge, and the rain kept its rhythm on the rock overhead, and the sea ran its ancient course in the dark below. The morning after the storm cleared was sharp and washed clean, the sky a brilliant and almost painful blue above the cove, the sea moving in long, smooth swells like something that had worked out a great restlessness and was now breathing easy. The rocks were wet and catching the early sun, and the smell of the air was the best thing Marshall had known in years. Kasha was standing on the outer rocks above the tide line when he found her. Not the same spot as before, higher up, where the cliff angled back enough to give a broad view of the sea and the sky both, with the ruin of Aldrath visible as a broken tooth on the headland to the north. She was standing with her arms at her sides and her face turned into the light, and in the gold morning she was the most stunning person he had ever seen. He climbed up and stood beside her. They looked out at the water together for a while, not talking, the wind gentle and the world very wide. "The shipment is cleared," she said. "My business at the cove is finished." He felt this land quietly in his chest. And the Doomhammer Council is 3 weeks' journey north," she said. "Up the coast road to Varen's Crossing and then inland through the pine country to the clan hold." She paused. "I was going to go alone." "You were going to go alone," he said. "And now I am thinking," she said, with a sideways look that was one of the best things about her, "that there is no reason to do that." He felt something enormous and warm settle into place in his chest. "I have no particular obligations here now that the ledgers are finished," he said, "and I know the coast road as far as Varen's Crossing. After that I would need a guide." "As it happens," she said, "I know the way." "Then we are well equipped," he said. She turned to face him fully, there on the high rocks with the sea behind her, and the sun making gold of her eyes and the wind moving the loose strands of her hair. She put her hand on his chest and looked at him. "You are not leaving a good situation to follow an uncertain one," she said. "You understand that. The cove was steady work. The clan country it will be harder." "The cloister was a steady situation," he said. "I left it because steady was not the same as alive." He covered her hand with his. "Wherever you are going is where I am alive." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped into him, which she had not done in the open before, closed the last distance and pressed herself against him with a completeness and an ease that said, "I am done being careful about this. I am done managing it." He brought his arms around her, solid and sure, and held her with the same certainty. "I need you to know something," she said, her voice lower now, close to his ear. "I am not easy to live with. I am opinionated and impatient, and I take up more space in a room than most people think I should." "I am aware," he said. "I find it one of your better qualities. I am also," she paused, "loyal completely to what I choose." "I know," he said. "I am too." They stood there on the high rock, with the whole enormous sea falling away below them and the sky immense above, and he tipped his head down and kissed her in the open morning light, slow and deliberate and full of everything they were, and everything they were going to be, with no audience required and no strategy needed, just the true and mutual weight of two people who had found each other in a smuggler's cove beneath a ruined watchtower, and decided, against all odds and conventions, that this was the thing worth choosing. The wind came up, warm from the south for once, and the sea ran and caught the light, and the moment stretched out and held. When they pulled apart, Marshall rested his forehead against hers. "North," he said. "North," she confirmed. 3 weeks. "Give or take," she said. "I walk fast." "I noticed," he said. "I have been keeping up with you for 7 weeks." She made the laugh sound low and real, the one that had become his favorite sound in the world, and he felt it against his chest like warmth from a good fire. They packed their things that afternoon. Marshall settled his accounts with Paraxalo, who shook his hand and gave him a look that was 3 parts respect and 1 part unspoken opinion, and said, "Do not get eaten by anything." "I will do my best," Marshall said. "She'll handle anything that tries," Parax said, with a nod toward Kasha, who was rolling her bedroll with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done it 500 times. "Yes," Marshall said, looking at her. "She will." They left the cove at first light the following morning, on the coastal cliff road with the sea below and the first pink of dawn behind them, their packs on their backs and the whole north ahead, and Marshall Whitaker felt more awake and more present and more completely himself than he had felt in years. The world was enormous and difficult and genuinely beautiful, and he was walking through it with Kasha Doomhammer at his side. The coast road was everything a coast road should be in that season: rutted, windy, intermittently beautiful, passing through small clifftop villages, where the people looked at them with the particular calculation of those who have learned to make quick assessments of strangers. Kasha walked with a warrior's bearing that was impossible to ignore, and Marshall walked at her shoulder, and most people made their assessments and found somewhere else to look. In one village, a coastal market town called Breath's Landing, they stopped at a tavern for a meal and a night's sleep, and the barkeep's expression went tight when they came in together. Marshall watched him work up to something and spoke before he could. "2 rooms if you have them, a meal if your kitchen is still running. We are paying travelers and nothing else." The barkeep looked at Kasha. Kasha looked at the barkeep with the absolute calm of someone who has been looked at that way before and found it profoundly boring. "2 rooms," the barkeep said finally. "Kitchen closes at 9. They ate a reasonably good fish stew, and in the morning Marshall found that someone had left a crude note under his door, 2 words, "uncharitable," that he read once and put in the cold ash of the room's small hearth. He told Kasha about it at breakfast because he had decided early in their acquaintance that honesty between them was not negotiable, and she listened with the still expression he had come to understand as controlled anger. "It happens," he said. "I know it happens," she said. "It will always happen in some places." "Yes," he said, "and it will not touch what is between us." She looked at him. "People will say things to you because of me. Your own kind will, Kasha." He put his hand on the table, open. She looked at it, and then she put her hand in it. "My own kind left me a note in cold ash this morning, and I am sitting across from the woman I love eating a reasonably good fish stew. I know which of those 2 things I care about." She held his hand for a moment and the tightness in her jaw eased. "You said it again," she said. "The woman I love, yes. I will keep saying it," he said, "until it stops being remarkable." "It may never stop being remarkable," she said. "Good," he said. "I prefer remarkable." They left Breath's Landing and continued north, and the country changed as they went, the tight clifftop villages giving way to longer stretches of open coast, then the road curving inland past salt marshes and pine forests, the air changing from salt to resin. They made camp in the open when there was no settlement, and it turned out that Marshall's cloister years had given him more practical outdoor skills than Kasha had expected. "You can actually make a fire," she said, the first evening he built one without her having to intervene. "The brothers took turns at the fire all winter," he said. "You learn or you are cold." She said, which was her version of impressed. He was learning her vocabulary. The half-sounds and the variations in her pauses that mapped to feelings, she had not quite built the habit of saying aloud. The hum of genuine approval, the hum of skepticism, the hum of something private and fond that she produced when she thought he was not paying attention. He was always paying attention. On the 5th evening of the road, camped beside a stream in pine country with the stars very thick above the tree canopy and the fire down to working coals, she told him about the first time she had fought seriously. Not a drill, not a sparring bout. A real border defense when she was 19, 3 years after her father died, when a raiding party had come through the clan's southern passage. She had held a choke point with 2 other warriors for 4 hours until the main force arrived. "Were you afraid?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "every moment. But you held. You hold because the alternative is worse," she said. "Fear is not the problem. The problem is if the fear moves faster than you do." He was quiet, thinking about that. "The cloister had a phrase for it," he said. "Let the storm pass through you, not around you." She turned her head to look at him. "Your cloister was not as useless as I initially assumed." "High praise," he said. She made the laugh sound and moved closer to him so that their shoulders were touching, and they looked at the fire together in the pine-scented dark. 2 weeks into the journey, they reached Varen's, crossing the last settlement before the inland road that would take them into Doomhammer clan territory. It was a real town, large enough to have a proper market square and a mill and a garrison of 6 soldiers, and the market was in full operation when they arrived, with all the noise and smell and jostling density of 100 people conducting their business at once. They were buying provisions, dried meat, hard cheese, fresh bread because they could, when they were approached by a large and very confident man in militia colors who put himself directly in their path and looked at Kasha with the specific expression of official unease. "Orc," he said, meaning it as a word of challenge, "you have passage papers." "I require no passage papers on the Varen Road," Kasha said. "It is a public thoroughfare." "Town prefers to know what's passing through," the man said. He had 2 other militiamen behind him, hanging back. "We are passing through," Marshall said evenly. "We are buying provisions and continuing north today." The man looked at him with the calculating expression of someone deciding whether this human's involvement was a complication or a convenience. A pause waited with several kinds of discomfort. "Your companion." "My partner," Marshall said. No equivocation. The word landed. The militiaman's expression did something complicated. "Partner," he repeated. "Yes," Marshall said, in the same even tone he had used for everything else. "We are traveling together to the Doomhammer clan hold. We have paid for our provisions. We require nothing from the garrison except the continued use of the public road." A small crowd had gathered, as crowds do at the smell of tension. Marshall was aware of them on the edges of his vision, market-goers with their baskets pausing, a couple of dock workers, 3 women at a cloth stall who had gone still. Kasha was standing at his shoulder, not in front of him, not behind him, beside him. And she was watching the militiaman with the expression that said she could end this encounter in 11 different ways and was choosing for the moment not to. The militiaman looked at the crowd, looked at Kasha, looked at Marshall. "Move along then," he said finally. "We do not want trouble." "Neither do we," Marshall said, and they paid for their provisions and walked out of the market square without hurrying. Once they were clear of the square and onto the north road, Kasha said quietly, "You did not flinch." "No, he was twice your size." "He was also wrong," Marshall said, "and he knew it. Men who know they are wrong flinch first, usually." She looked at him as they walked, the road stretching ahead under pine boughs. "I have been looking after myself for a long time," she said, "on roads like this, being looked at the way that man looked at me." "I know," he said. "I did not need you to handle it." "I know that too," he said. "I did not handle it for you. I handled it because I am your partner, and that was my part of it." She was quiet for a few paces, then, "You're part of it." "We are a pair," he said. "We each do our part." Another few paces. Then she reached over and took his hand, briefly and firmly, mid-stride, and squeezed once and let go. It was the most public display of affection she had offered in any settlement, and it was worth more to him than a speech. The Doomhammer clan hold was not what Marshall had pictured, which had been something temporary and camp-like. It was, instead, a substantial and permanent settlement in a mountain valley, with stone-founded longhouses and a forge building that he could smell before he could see hot iron and coal and the particular mineral sharpness of worked metal. The surrounding valley was forested and defensible, the paths in well-worn, the whole place carrying the quality of somewhere that had been here for a long time and intended to continue. People noticed them from a distance. Kasha was recognized, the attention shifted and sharpened when they identified her, and Marshall was assessed very thoroughly by approximately 40 pairs of eyes before they had walked 50 paces past the hold's outer boundary. No one stopped them, but the watching was complete. Kasha brought him to the hold's common hall, a long stone building with a fire pit in the center and rough-hewn tables, and an atmosphere that was somewhere between a gathering place and a courthouse. She spoke to a gray-haired orc woman near the fire, briefly, in Orcish, and the gray-haired woman looked at Marshall with an expression that was not unkind, but was extremely thorough. The council was convened the following morning. There were 7 elders. They sat at the far end of the common hall's longest table, and they looked at Marshall with the collective assessment of 7 people who had been entrusted with the welfare of a community and took that seriously. Kasha stood at his side. The gray-haired woman, Elder Tora, Kasha had told him spoke first. She spoke in Orcish, and Kasha translated in a low voice beside him. She asks you to account for yourself. Your name, your origins, your intentions. Marshall stood straight. He spoke clearly and without embellishment. His name was Marshall Whitaker. He was 26 years old. He had spent 4 years as a lay brother at the Morn's Peak Cloister and left it to make his way in the world. He had worked as a ledger-keeper at Slant-Tooth Cove for Peric Sallow's operation, which was not above board but was not violent, and he was honest about that. He had met Kasha Doomhammer in that cove and found her to be the most formidable, honest, and genuine person he had ever encountered. He intended to be beside her on whatever road and under whatever conditions for as long as she would have him. Kasha translated. The council listened. Elder Tora asked something else. She asks, Kasha said with a quality in her voice that was only very slightly unsteady, what you offer. Marshall thought for a moment, not because he did not have an answer but because he wanted the answer to be the true one. Nothing material, he said. No clan, no property, no particular standing. What I offer is this: complete loyalty, complete honesty, and the willingness to learn whatever this life requires of me. I have no trade that a Forge clan needs, but I can learn. And I will not leave, not for easy roads or comfortable alternatives or the opinions of other people. I will not leave. Kasha translated. Last words, I will not leave, were quiet in the room when she said them. Elder Tora looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Kasha and said something brief. She says, Kasha translated, and now her voice was entirely steady because she was controlling it precisely, that the bond mark exchange is recognized under clan custom. She says you speak like a man who knows the weight of words. A pause. She says you may stay. The other elders said nothing to contradict this. Marshall let out a breath. Kasha, very slightly, let out the same breath. Elder Tora looked between them with the ancient, unimpressible wisdom of someone who had seen many things come before her council and recognized the genuine article when it arrived. She said one more thing in Orcish. What did she say? Marshall asked. Kasha was quiet for a moment. Then, soft, she says your father would have found you a good match. He felt this in a very deep place, quietly and completely. He looked at Kasha, and she was looking at him with the open amber warmth that she did not show to anyone else, and he reached over and took her hand, in the middle of the council hall, in front of all 7 elders of the Doomhammer clan. She held it. They stayed in the clan hold through the rest of that season, and Marshall learned what there was to learn and worked what there was to work, and found that the Forge clan community, for all its strangeness to him, operated on principles. He recognized honesty, labor, loyalty, and accepted him in the way that self-sufficient communities accept anyone who is willing to earn their place rather than demand it. He learned enough Orcish to hold a basic conversation within the first month, which delighted Elder Tora and startled most of the younger clan members, and which made Kasha look at him with a particular soft expression that she produced only when she thought he had done something unexpectedly perfect. Goreth Blacktide's formal objection was submitted to the council and reviewed, and in light of the completed bond exchange and Elder Tora's recognition, dismissed. It arrived as a written document by courier and was handled in an afternoon council session that Marshall was not required to attend, and Kasha came back from it in the early evening and said simply, "It is resolved." And that was the end of Goreth Blacktide. What it was not the end of was the rest of their lives, which were full and complicated and good. On a clear evening near the end of that first season, with the clan holed quiet in the blue dusk and the valley below them filling with shadow, Marshall and Kasha climbed to the ridge above the hold where the sky opened up in all directions, east to the lowlands, and the coastal road, north to the deeper mountains, south toward the sea they had both come from, west to the sunset that was painting everything in colors a cloister artist would have prayed over. They stood on the ridge and the world fell away in every direction, enormous and indifferent and genuinely beautiful. Kasha turned to him. She put her hands on his face, careful and deliberate, the way she had first put them on his face on the cliff path in the rain, and she looked at him for a long moment with those amber eyes that were all gold now in the last of the light. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what I told the council, what the formal bond means in full." "Tell me," he said. "In full," she said, "it means what I said on the dock that first day, and what I showed on the dock the second day, and what I told you in the cave by the fire, that I choose you, completely, that I am done with half things and careful arrangements and keeping my own counsel on what I actually feel." He was very still. The sunset moved behind her. "I am not easy," she said. "I know I am not easy. I have not found you difficult," he said honestly. "I have found you real." She looked at him. "I love you," she said, the same tone as before, the tone for facts, for irreducible truths. "I want you to know that it is not because of the ruin and the cove and the necessity of Goreth. It started there, but this is not that anymore. This is what is left after all of that is gone, and what is left is simply that I love you." "Kasha," he said, his voice rough, "I have loved you since you trimmed my lamp wick." She made a startled sound that became a laugh, full and real, and he kissed her while she was laughing, which was one of the best things he had ever done, and she kissed him back without stopping laughing for a moment, and then the laughing turned into something else entirely, slow and warm and full and certain. They stood on the ridge in the open evening air with the last gold light on them and the whole world open in every direction, his hands in her hair and her hands at his shoulders, and they claimed each other in the most complete and private and genuine sense, not for a watching dock or a formal council, but for themselves, for the fact of it, for the irreducible truth that they had found each other in an underground cove at the edge of the sea, and neither of them was the same person they had been before. The stars came out above them, one by one, the same stars that had been above the cove when Marshall first opened his eyes after the ruin came down, the same stars that had been there when Kasha sat 3 feet away from him and watched the sea and pretended she had not been waiting for 2 hours just to see him breathe. "I would carry you out of that ruin again," she said, against his cheek, quietly. "I would let you," he said, "and then I would get up and walk beside you." She pulled back just far enough to see his face, and the look she gave him had nothing held back in it at all, no armor, no measurement, no calculation. Just Kasha Doomhammer, completely and finally herself, choosing him the way she did everything, completely, honestly, and without reserve. "Beside me," she said. "Every road," he said. The valley below was dark and the sky above was full of stars, and neither of them went back down for a long time.